furthering governance and leadership at several levels, is exactly what the next panel discussion is about. And it's going to be ably led by Oliver Morton. Oliver, up you come. Briefings editor of The Economist, who's got a great panel lined up. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Misha. Thanks very much, everyone. Yes, as Misha said, we have a smart, experienced, and diverse panel coming up who should come up sort of now, because otherwise I'm just a guy standing on stage telling you about a panel that isn't here. And here we have a panel. Carlos dos Santos, who's the High Commissioner of Mozambique to United Kingdom, Maria Ivanova, Julia Marton-Lefèvre, Anne Glover, and Patricia Pinho. So if you'd welcome them all, we'll get down to business. I understand the arrangement here is that when you want to ask something, you tweet it or text it, and I think instructions about how to do that will be up on the screens. When you panelists want to talk, you sort of like look really eager, and I notice that you're very eager and want to say something. And occasionally I will, of course, ask questions myself. We're talking, in case you've come in from somewhere else, about delivering governance for global sustainability at all scales. And it struck me coming into the meeting this morning that we've been on a fairly local scale here, though it is a vast cacophonous hall of a local scale. It is rather a local and inward-looking. And from this local scale, we've been taking a very global outlook. Outside in the national scale in Britain, those of you who are British or who have turned on that television channel will have noticed that we in Britain have been having this week a heartfelt debate about temperature and taxation. Which is good, except for the fact that it's unfortunately not about global temperature and carbon taxation. It's about the temperature of takeaway food and the taxation of Cornish pasties. I think it's fair to say that in many of these issues we face various problems of perspective and of size. But though it's easy to make fun and gratifying to make fun of the problem of Cornish pasties and taxation of takeaway food, that issue does actually reflect in microcosm many of the issues that I think we need to address here today. Issues of resources, of moving resources around, of privilege and what counts as privilege, and of values that sit behind our decisions on these matters. And to begin with, I thought I'd turn to Maria Ivanova and ask, what should we define as governance in this world of privileges, scarce resources, and differing values?
Thank you, Oliver. It's a pleasure to be here. And isn't it funny that we get this question at the very last session of a conference on governance? So I can tell, and it's just an indicator that we all define governance in our own way. And it means something to all of us. As a professor, I have to have a definition of governance, and I'll just share with you what I use in my classroom, what I use with my students, and I define governance in what I do as simply as the design and execution of policy. And that doesn't mean that governance is designed or executed by government. Not at all. All of the design and execution of policy, whether it's about environment, whether it's about trade, whether it is about food, happens at multiple levels by multiple actors. But we have to have a common goal. So it is a very simple, and I hope not a simplistic definition from me, the design and execution of policy. And you can fill in the blank, whether it's global governance, global environmental governance, and so forth.
Well, I wonder then if we could turn to Carlos for a brief account of how the design and execution of policy looks on the regional level in Africa at the moment.
Well, first of all, let me thank the organizers of this conference for bringing so many people, so much knowledge to this gathering and to inform policy decisions that will take place later in Rio. In Africa, we know that for the governments and organizations of Africa to succeed in fighting poverty, in democratic governance, they have to have good governance that will enable implementation of policy. And because of that consciousness, they try to establish structures at continental level. The African Union with its NEPAD program, and then the regional organizations like SADC in Southern Africa, ECOWAS in West Africa, and the others that form the building blocks of bringing those governance structures to bear at the continental level. But there has to be a link also to the national governance structures. And here again, there's a lot of work to make sure that Africans use each other's experiences to build on governance. And the African peer review mechanism is the innovative way that they found to look at each other's capacities, experiences, to bring governance to a more standardized way of doing things in Africa. And I think this will help countries. It was misunderstood when it was approved, because it was thought that countries of Africa were going to police each other. But that was not the idea. The idea is actually to teach each other, to learn from each other's experience. And we hope that the global world can help Africa to do that, and also establish the link with the global governance architecture.
Well, Julia, I think that you have an experience at IUCN of working with various different governance structures, entities who are normally not governed in the same sort of structure, NGOs and governments. Is that something that makes you hopeful for thinking that those sorts of gaps can be bridged?
Yes. First of all, I like the word architecture. My organization, IUCN, was invented and the architecture was designed in 1948, a long time ago, 64 years ago. And one of our founding fathers, I'm glad to see this gender-balanced panel, but I think we had, not balanced, well, it's a different balance. So one of our founders designed this architecture which had governments and NGOs in one organization, talking to each other, exchanging information, and actually setting the governance framework for the conservation of nature. It was really a brave and unusual decision. I think the governance architecture that the world needs to bring those voices in one room to discuss together in a democratic parliament. What's missing in our architecture is business. They're not inside, but we work a lot with business. I think that is the biggest challenge. How do we bring those voices inside the room? And that's what IUCN's architecture was designed at, and it works. It's complicated, but the issues are complicated.
Well then, as we heard on a previous panel, how do we actually take business as the representatives of a growing economy into that governance structure? Do you have any, I mean, we obviously haven't managed it yet.
No, but I think there are an awful lot more bridges built toward individual businesses which want to enter into this discussion, which feel the pressure that the planet is under, and also with organizations of businesses. The World Business Council on Sustainable Development, established 20 years ago at the last Rio conference, is a very good example. The Global Compact. We at IUCN have links, very close links with all of them.
Okay.
That's just the first step, though.
You said we at IUCN, and I realized in my last question I'd actually broken what I wanted to set up as a ground rule for this discussion, which is that I would like to avoid using the term we unless people define who they mean by we.
Okay.
Because I think that one of the most basic facts about politics is it depends on who you get people to believe that they are a we with. And that actually leads to a question that we have from the webcast from Chris Bradford, which I thought I might throw to Patricia, because this is a question about not just the scale in terms of type of organization, or the scale in terms of regional versus global, but a question about scale in temporal terms. And what Chris is asking is, what is the panel's view of the proposal for an ombudsperson for future generations, which is currently included in the zero draft for Rio +20? And this is like, I think, something that Andy Revkin was writing about recently, Carolyn Reffensberger's idea of a legal guardian for future generations. How do we bring time into governance?
So it's curious that I was thinking over the past of this conference that two of the most important scholars that have influenced my academic life were here, and they, Eleonore Ostrom and Berta Becker from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and they both women who have been working into the interdisciplinary arena, and throughout the time has been, made a great influence on the, in showing and demonstrate the importance of scale and dealing with common pool, natural resource, and stressing the importance of, the property rights and local actors or local domain as an arena where change really happens. And then I think that's, and then keeping also as we as scholars looking at the global scale interconnected. And I think in terms of Timescale, we have seen from my Brazilian experience in the policy arena there, throughout the years, how the international domain has greatly influenced the evolution of the social environmental agenda in Brazil. And for instance, Rio 92 UN Millennium Assessment, and now we have lots of hopes for the Rio +20. So that takes time, and but we are really seeing the progress of how this agenda are constructed. But the problem is that we always see that without a profound change on our thinking in the economic development, it is strategies and initiatives are always outweighed. So really needed to bring these two agendas together. I think the, both economic development with the social environment agenda across levels in all government. And I think that's my hope for this future. And
Maria, you were looking like you wanted to come in on the temporal question.
I actually want to comment on the question exactly of the Ombudsperson and the intergenerational issues. And I'm coming at this from my role as a coordinating lead author in the Global Environment Outlook. This is the assessment that UNEP carries out every 5 years. And I was responsible with several other colleagues for leading the charge on Chapter 16. Which is about global responses. In a sense, it is what this session is about, the action agenda. And one of our thoughts and recommendations there, the thought was the Ombudsperson idea for future generation, but the recommendation that we came up with was an intergenerational assembly. That it's not just one person, but that is an assembly where young people can meet. And it's very much along the lines of what Julia was saying, that we need different governance structures where you bring these other actors. Even in response to Ban Ki-moon's message this morning of whether to have a scientific advisor to the UN, Julia and I were sitting next to each other and had the same reaction at the same time. One person in the whole UN? Wouldn't it be much better to have a group of scientists? And in the same idea, in the GO5, in Chapter 16, we propose an intergenerational assembly, but it's very much along the idea of an ombudsperson. It's just a shared governance structure.
Feel free. Anne, you've been involved in advising governments and intergovernmental organizations on science policy. How do you respond to those sorts of ideas?
Well, I think what you need science for, and we all know this, is to generate the evidence. And it's what you do with that evidence that's really important. So if we take Julia's definition at the beginning, that governance is about design and execution of policy, if we've got the evidence, then in an ideal world, we would use that to design and execute the policy. We would have governance. But who are we trying to govern? Okay, so where are we directing that policy? And
yes,
I'm meaning we as a global community. Where is the governance going? And I would just like to give you one example which has struck me very forcefully, and I think we need to speak about it, all of us. And it's this: if you just go across the room into the exhibition hall and you go to the Met Office stand, you will see some predictions about how global warming will impact on the planet. Now, I can look at that, and I can see how I would design a policy as a scientist. I can show it to children, I can show it to society at large, and they will see that we need some change. And actually, we can probably show it to ministers, and ministers will accept that looking at these predictions, which have quite low degrees of uncertainty, that we need change. But who do ministers look to? I think that if you look at the financial market, and the financial market is all-powerful, and we've heard various things about the financial market throughout this conference, and one statement I was struck by was that the market is not moral. So what does the market do with the evidence that we have produced at great cost, that's been peer-reviewed, and that's got a very high level of confidence? The market looks at that and sees, there's an area of permafrost being thawed out. That would be a good place to start buying up land for new crop production. So you think about where your commodity markets might go to. You look at who's got water and who hasn't got water, and that might be the basis of investment. Now, if we need governance, I think we need to use our scientific evidence as the basis of strong policy, the design and implementation of policy, but we need to focus it where it will make a difference.
But don't you put your finger there on one of the fundamental dichotomies, which is that policy is very strongly value-laden. And the scientific evidence is, the policy must necessarily be strongly value-laden. It reflects who we are and what we think about things, not just the facts of the world. So how would you then bridge that gap? Because it almost sounded like you were saying that if you get the facts right, the policy will follow.
Well, it's not if you get the facts right. The facts just are. Although, science is all about uncertainty. I'm happy to say that. But what we do is reduce uncertainty. So we are left with a body of evidence that is compelling. And we need to act on that. And I don't think, if you start talking about, well, the value component of that, or in a way that's a bit of an irrelevance, because what we have to do, and we heard it just in a preamble to this session today, that economic systems have to change, and they have to change in light of the evidence. I mean, there isn't any way that you can, in my mind, looking at the evidence and looking at what comes out to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and remind ourselves we spend a huge amount of money on generating this very high-quality evidence. And we're not just doing that to make ourselves feel better or that we can put it on a shelf and it looks good. We have to use that, or we fail ourselves as a species in a way. We have to use it, but we need to identify where the barriers are in getting that evidence used to design the policy. And
just to backtrack there, we're saying we as scientists.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there's an interesting question from Andy Morse on Twitter, which I understand is getting retweeted a lot, which I can imagine where it came from. Would a more matriarchal governance system be better for global sustainability? Obviously, I'm going to turn to Carlos first.
Well, we value the role of women, and in Africa, that role is growing. The structures of the African Union are 50% women, 50% men, and there should be no justification that we don't have candidates for women commissioners. And that is good, and it is being good for Africa. I don't know that just matriarchal societies would be better governed. I think the combination of women and men leading the world is good. But I wanted to take this opportunity to also make the case about the Ombudsman and the Assembly, which I like the point about Assembly. And one point which has been made by Africa, which is UNEP. I think we need to make it a more robust organization an entity that can do work to integrate the pillars of environment, economic, and social, one that will have funding and will have democratic decisions taken by all, and taking into account the specificities of Africa, of Asia, Latin America, developing world. Africa can actually become a place where you develop green economy, but you need to enable Africans to do that. They don't possess the knowledge, they don't possess the technological capacities, but they are at the initial stages of modes of consumption, industrialization. It may be harder to change habits in Europe, but I grew up in a village, and I used to take my bath every morning with a bucket of maybe 5, not more than 10 liters of water. And I can go back to that practice without much difficulty. I'm not sure I can convince you to do that because you have never done it. I think we have a window of opportunity, but we need to enable Africa to do that. Help Africa to build capacities, human capacity, knowledge, and all these. And the structures of governance should take that into account.
Julia, would you like to talk about the matriarchy?
Just for a moment, and that is, I think, I don't like either matriarchy or patriarchy, if that's the male version of that, but how about making sure that, again, these voices are participating in an equal manner, make sure that the doors are open to women as well as men, and together I think we can have a much better governance system. I'd like to say another word, if I may, just to follow up on the strengthening of the so-called, the environmental so-called pillar. First of all, I think we've got to stop talking about pillars. Pillars don't move, they can't touch each other. I think one of the things that is clear in this conference, as elsewhere, is that we're talking about breaking down the silos and more integration, a more systemic approach to the complexity, the pressures that we're facing. So, indeed, the environmental strand of the sustainability challenge that we've set for ourselves and that journey that we're on should be stronger, and it should absolutely be in close touch with the other strands of sustainable development. If possible, in the same room. That's a dream about an architecture that I've got, but at least in close touch. And please, let's not talk about pillars. They don't move. I think they're just stuck in their own silos.
Well, I'm not going to say anything about patriarchy and pillars. And,
okay.
I am, however, going to turn over the question to Zev Trachtenberg, who's at the University of Oklahoma, or possibly at Queen's University of Belfast, which is goes to the heart of some of these issues about where governance rubs up against politics and against the actual exercise of power, which is, he asks, can there be governance without compulsion? Can governance be purely voluntary? What level of compulsion is necessary in governance for global sustainability? I think I'll go to Maria with that.
Compulsion.
Yes, there can be governance without compulsion. That is actually at the core of it. But what does that really mean, and what is compulsion? Can there be governance without regulation? I don't think so. We need to regulate societies politically, economically, socially. We self-regulate even ourselves. Regulation is at the core of our planet. It's a system that has all these regulatory mechanisms, and what we're trying to do in society, in a sense, is mimic, is copy some of these mechanisms. But at the core of good governance or effective governance is responsibility. And I think when we think about how to go forward with governance, we have to think about who takes responsibility. And that is where your we is absolutely critical. Who is the we and at what levels? And the we is different at different levels. It's different in different conferences or in different gatherings. But how do we take responsibility as citizens, as individuals, as universities, as countries even. And that is where this perceived compulsion or perceived regulation comes in. We regulate everything that we do. And just the threat, the ability, because the flip side of regulation is that your grievance can actually be taken care of. Because if we have a mechanism at the international level where we can go with the grievance, whether it's about pollution, whether it is about the use of a natural resource, then that threat of regulation, that possibility to adjudicate will actually give us rights, not only responsibilities but rights. And rights and responsibilities come together. And to me, that is the core of governance.
But that brings us back to the key question. I'll go on to Anne with this then. The key question about what we mean by we, what I mean by we. It's fairly easy to define local we's.
Yeah.
There's been a great historical project of defining we on the basis of class solidarity. There's been a very successful political and geopolitical project of defining we on the basis of nation. How do you even begin to start defining we on the basis of the globe? Yeah. How do you begin to form from those local, national, regional polities? How do you start producing the sort of we that can actually provide those mechanisms of redress that Maria was talking about? So I'm not sure if that actually led to what you wanted to say, Anne, but that's what I'd ask you to now address.
Okay, so I'll try and marry the two then. I was struck, Julia, you said something there about we regulate everything we do, and I don't think we do regulate everything that we do. So at the extreme end of poverty, there's little regulation there about what happens, and at the extreme levels of wealth, there is very little regulation about how that's accumulated. And just something that struck me yesterday, and these were someone else's observations, not mine, was that if you look at the Millennium Development Goals, they're all focused on poverty. There are none of those focused on wealth. That's a very odd thing indeed, and I don't quite understand that, because it's, we live in a closed system, and so if you look at the science of a closed system, it's not entirely closed. We have solar energy and gravity are the two things that are not closed. Everything else is limited, and therefore we have to have a governance, and I'm nervous about saying we now, but I'm not sure we're not being a little bit precious about this we thing, because you probably understand what I mean. But in governance, looking towards Rio +20, surely there has to be an agreement there around governance of what we go back with, and we in terms of the people at Rio +20. How do they go back to their countries, their nations, and how do they think about implementing a governance system that will lead us to sustainability on the planet? Because that's the goal that I think everyone has in mind. But I think that we need to focus our attention using the evidence, not just on what is the status quo. The status quo won't work, and I think we need to keep reminding ourselves of that, because we carry on day to day. Every one of you, I guess, in this hall will carry on today as you did yesterday, and you'll do the same thing tomorrow. You're not changing because you think, actually, I better start changing now, and it's urgent because there's going to be a big problem sooner than I think. So you're not regulating yourselves. You're just waiting for someone else to do it. But I think that probably there is the will. I think people are now understanding that the reasons are very compelling. And so we need to give a lot of support to what happens in Rio +20, and we should have high expectation for it. Because I'm concerned that people are looking at Rio +20 and thinking, no, nothing much is going to happen. If you have low expectation like that, any tiny little thing will seem good. But a tiny little thing isn't enough.
That's a very interesting question for we, the people in the hall. Could I see a show of hands of people who genuinely feel they have high expectations of Rio +20? Okay, I wouldn't say that was a strong majority. I would say, keep your hands up. Okay, high expectations are there, but I would say they are probably in a relatively small minority. Does anyone disagree with my judgment? Because my eyes aren't great.
You're right.
So one of the problems here is something that Bob Watson was talking about yesterday in a session on converging megatrends or possibly contenting megaverges. But it was a very good session. And he was saying that he felt the governance systems at all levels were fundamentally flawed. I think the term he used was rotten because of the role of vested interests at every level, which of course goes to Anne's point about, why is this not already happening? And I wondered if anyone on the panel had a view about at what level tackling vested interests was easiest, and where because if you just say it's all the status quo is reinforced regardless of level by vested interests, you have a problem for action. But if you were looking for the level where you thought vested interests were most easily outmaneuvered, co-opted, or basically beaten, which level would you be thinking of? Anyone? Carlos.
Well, I think it's always easy to deal with these things at the national level because you can regulate, you can force people easily to do things. I think the most important thing is actually to agree, identify the problem, agree on what needs to be done and how. And I think conferences like these, bringing science and the evidence to everyone, I think will probably build a common understanding of the seriousness of the situation, because we still have people who doubt that this whole thing is being made up in labs. But when you bring evidence such that we're finding, and also the disasters that we're encountering in places where there has never been disasters, then you create a common understanding. And then when you understand that we are facing a common risk, it shouldn't be so difficult to build a governance system at regional level. It's always easier to start with the small block and then go to the global level. But now we are pressed for time. We don't have time to wait to start these. We need to put in place structures that can actually keep the linkages of the national, the regional, the sub-regional, the continental, and the global ones. And I think the United Nations, no matter what people say, is one forum, the universal forum, where we can build this. And if you look at where we were 30 to 50 years ago and where we are today, I think the UN has played much greater role than we give credit to it. We look at its failings, but I think we can get more. It's a case for multilateralism. I think we need to do more, and I would urge scientists to really try and help build that case in that direction.
Julia, I think you wanted to...
Just one word that I think I'd like to add to your design, your architecture, by starting really at the local, at the community level, even at the family level. And then let's build up to the architecture that you've designed. You know, people who are living close to nature, our life support, are stewards of the science that scientists are working on. They understand the problems. They know when they have to go for kilometers to get the water that you described. So let's start really at the community level, and then let's build up, and let's make sure that the messages at all levels, you know, are similar, are the same. And we need to learn how to listen to each other at all those levels.
That's an interesting conception, though, especially with our talk earlier today about the Anthropocene, the idea that some people are closer to nature than others. It seems to me that everyone is about the next lungful of air away from a very profound connection with nature. Maria, you wanted to come in on the same point.
Yes, I want to come on the same point with a very brief answer to your question. The short answer is the campus level. And that is the community of we that I speak about. And I have seen what happens on campuses about sustainability that is absolutely transforming. It is critical, and it has the potential of being taken up year after year for generations and in transformative leaps. Now students at universities, I can speak for the United States where I have witnessed that campus sustainability movement. Now when they think about sustainability, they think in the same breath from garbage to governance. And at the college where I used to be previously, the College of William and Mary in Virginia, the students taxed themselves voluntarily, $30 a year, just for sustainability. And that would generate about $220,000 a year just for sustainability. But they went further than that and said, well, now we will create the governance structure to actually operate this fund. Part of it will be for research, part of it will be for operational projects, and part of it will be invested in an endowment. And then the business school students invested that endowment. And in the direst of crises in the United States, that was the only investment the university had made that actually was profitable because it was in sustainability companies. And when you have young people not only thinking that way, not only being educated, but actually learning by doing and by thinking about those issues integratively, then they take it to whatever community they begin associating themselves with. They come from different communities, but also in their lives, they go to different communities.
That's a wonderful perspective. It fits nicely also with a question we've just had our text from Sequela at the University of Botswana, pointing out Richard Norgaard on this stage before us was talking about the stress to the system created by what he called excessive consumerism, which of course probably speaks to a more atomized, less community-oriented vision of society. What is the governance solution to the problem as he defined it in terms of consumerism? Anne?
Well, I think there is a role for governments, there's a role for regulation, because what regulation could do in terms of excessive consumerism is to create a level playing field for business. So if you're talking about, I'm linking it back to your previous question on vested interests, it's actually heartening to hear that individual people can make an effort. And all of you made an effort because this is a carbon neutral conference, but you need to be careful about what that means. It means that £40 or so of your conference subscription went to doing something else. It's not actually carbon neutral, but it's a good thought, and people have contributed. In terms of business, how are business just voluntarily, if you've got two businesses doing the same thing, as one business with people who care going to decide, well, in our business, we're going to do this, which might be more expensive or whatever. No, they're not, because their investors are not going to allow that. The business will not succeed. If you have regulation, that can be enabling, so that it has to be the right regulation. And this is for economists, this is for social scientists, this is for political scientists to think about how can you get imaginative regulation that provides that level playing field so that business can do what we want in terms of being able to deliver a response to the evidence. So, it's all possible, but I don't think it can be done voluntarily. Individuals can react voluntarily. But in terms of our economy, I think it has to be regulation.
So it's interesting that I know of at least one British climate scientist who's not at this meeting because he doesn't approve of the offsetting policy of this meeting. So it's not not as simple as that.
Yeah.
But Patricia, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think it's crucial also to think about the cultural aspects involving consumerism. Like I think people, not only building I think we need to create the conditions where individual behavior can really make a difference, and I think that's crucial. I feel that sometimes people really do want to make a difference, but they don't have the large structure that can be supportive and can help them to make the transition to a more sustainable future. So I think that's what we have been discussing here, governance across scales, these polycentric approaches of different levels of governance, that we can really create the structures that we can really make a difference and build up. It's a building a block of, you know, and then generating a collective action across levels to this transition in a more sustainable future.
That bringing forward of the notion of polycentric, which we're running a little short of time, but actually brings up a very important sort of like metaphorical aspect to this debate, which we tend to think in terms of layers, a sort of like sedimentary view of the small building up to the big. Should we be striving for a system of governance in which the global is one voice among many, rather than thinking of it as the top voice that controls all?
I think so.
Since you're making the mistake of nodding, Julia, I'll ask you to expand on that.
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I'm not sure. But I do think the global has to be connected to the local in a much better way than it is today. So it's not exactly agreeing with you. Again, the architecture, I think, has got to really build on this desire of people to change, but they don't have a framework in which to do it. I am surprised that there isn't really yet a movement on the street from all your young people in the United States that needs a lot of convincing to get on with this. There is a pressure on our planet that's huge. I think certainly educated people know that, and there are more and more educated people, luckily. Why not, you know, make sure that that our politicians who we elect in many countries of the world actually deliver what we want them to promise. We've got to stick to them. In the global framework, we are so used to going to different negotiations, so-called conferences of the parties, where different parts of government make promises about bits and pieces of the Earth system, and then we forget one promise made last October when we make new promises in December and so on. We've got to bring it together. It has to be a systemic approach.
Well, thanks very much. That more or less brings us to a close. I wanted to bring out just one voice that's not been heard here, but which for me is an important voice about this, which is from the end of the book by the French social thinker Bruno Latour, We Have Never Been Modern, when he talks about the notion of a parliament of things in which representatives of people, of organizations, and of nature itself can all talk together about these problems. And this beautiful quote, "Half of our politics is constructed in science. Half of nature is constructed in society. Let us patch the two back together, and the political task can begin." So from governance to politics, thank you very much for the panel. Thank you very much for listening. And I think Misha now has an announcement before sending us all off to lunch.
Don't go, don't go, don't go. Okay. I just want to say that was masterful moderation by Oliver.
Thank you.
I was taking notes. Thank you. Brilliant panel. Thank you very much. And I was especially struck by your comment, Mr. Dos Santos, about challenging all of us. Can we have a bath with 5 liters of water? I'm going to see. Thank you very much.